McNutt here. You will struggle to find a life lived with more daring, adventure, confidence, and compassion than that of one Elizabeth Cochran. That's a temporary starter name, just a placeholder. We'll upgrade that in just a moment. As you're about to find out, her mold was broken upon creation because she is simply rare. Ultimately, she was a journalist, an investigative journalist to be more accurate, but that label doesn't even come close to doing her justice. I'll tell her story, you try to come up with a label. Let's begin with how she got her start. In 1885, a man named Erasmus Fussy Britches Wilson wrote an article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled, "What Are Girls Good For?" This was not an all-encompassing list. It began and ended with those good old staples of birthing, cooking, cleaning, with some cooking and a bit of cleaning tossed in as well. It didn't take long for an alternative view to arrive at newspaper HQ from the pen name Little Orphan Girl. LOG's dissent and disgust were immediately evident as she stated that E.F. Wilson's views were exactly what stood in the way of women being able to stand on their own. The Pittsburgh Dispatch was impressed with this little lady and offered her a job. Little Orphan Girl, yes, Elizabeth Cochran, changed her pen name to Nelly Bly, and a star went supernova. Originally, the paper wanted this young upstart to cover lifestyle issues, things like fashion, cooking, gardening. Didn't we just talk about that? Bly wasn't having it. Nelly wasn't there to play nice. She was there to expose real issues and to actually change things. In a field dominated by men, Bly quickly distinguished herself by tackling hard-hitting social issues, including the harsh working conditions faced by women in factories and as domestic servants for the wealthy and elite. Nelly said, "In our country, when a woman asks for justice, all of the hands that should be extended in kindness and aid are raised in derision and scorn." But she didn't just ask questions. Nelly went undercover, a thing no one else was doing. She discovered women in cramped workspaces laboring up to 12 hours at a time with no breaks, sweltering conditions, and pay as little as $3 to $4 per week. But even that paltry amount often shrank after various deductions involving repairs or anything the boss man could dream up. She exposed those who exploited the vulnerable and took advantage of the desperate. You get it. Nelly Bly was a badass, fearless, intelligent, clever, ballsy, and determined. Even so, her most famous expose really took all of those aforementioned attributes, hit them with a defibrillator turned up to 11, and then shot them in the ass with a gallon-sized syringe of adrenaline. And I don't think I'm exaggerating on this. In 1886, Nelly moved to New York and met with a man whom you know for his fancy prizes, Joseph Pulitzer. You've heard of him. Pulitzer was running a newspaper called the New York World. Oh, right. A newspaper was like an oversized, flimsy book of the day with a collection of stories that happened yesterday. This book was folded in such a beautiful, perfect way that once you opened it, it could never be refolded into that same stunning form you received it in. Nelly was pitched a potentially preposterous plan by Pulitzer. He wanted her to go undercover at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. She was intrigued and gave the scheme 2 thumbs up. She asked how they planned to get her out once she was legally committed. They said they were working on it. Okay, this is way bigger than your average trust fall test. The first step for Nelly was to get committed. She knew she would have to be believable and feign mental illness to gain entry into the asylum. First, she practiced in front of a mirror to adopt an erratic and confused demeanor. Once she was satisfied with her crazy-eyed stare, she checked into a boarding house for women and began exhibiting bizarre behavior such as refusing to sleep and accusing others of being insane. Her act was convincing and soon the police were called. She was taken before a judge for a perfunctory medical examination and declared insane, which was a little too easy. Bly was committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. Her plan worked perfectly, and now she could experience the brutal conditions and suffering firsthand. Upon entering the asylum, Bly dropped her act and began behaving normally. Now, I don't know if she did this to be like, aha, I tricked you all, or if it was more of a, oh shit, this is serious, I've made a terrible mistake. Regardless, the doctors refused to believe she was sane. I imagine it went something like this. Hi, yeah, I'm like totally normal. No, it says here you're batshit crazy. Oh, do I look crazy? It's crazy how normal you look, which is insane. I snuck in here on purpose. You sound like a lunatic. Nelly, sadly, showed just how easy it was for someone to be unjustly committed. During her stay, she witnessed and endured terrible conditions. Nelly said, "What, accepting torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment?" Patients were forced to take ice-cold baths and were rarely given clean water. The asylum was filthy, and Bly described the rooms as cold and damp and unsanitary. Nurses were often cruel, verbally abusive, and physically violent. Bly witnessed patients being slapped, choked, and tied up for resisting or even asking questions. Bly stated they were being punished for being mentally ill. Many of the doctors showed little concern for the patient's well-being and made superficial diagnosis without attempting to understand the patient's conditions. Bly described how some women who were clearly sane or had mild issues were treated exactly the same as those with severe mental illness. Bly stated, "The insane asylum on Blackwell's Island is a human rat trap. It's easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out." Patients were fed rotten meat, spoiled butter, and given nasty water. Bly mentioned that most of the food was inedible, and many women were slowly wasting away from malnutrition. Nelly said, "I have watched patients stand and gaze longingly toward the city they in vain wish to reach." Many patients were left in isolation with no mental stimulation or access to any kind of therapy or exercise. Speaking out about being treated poorly was one way you could earn solitary confinement. Bly discovered that many women in the asylum were not insane, but were immigrants who didn't speak English, poor women who had no support system, or people who had simply been labeled inconvenient by society. These women, like her, had little chance of being released once inside. The asylum was overcrowded, and many women were institutionalized for life without anything remotely resembling a professional diagnosis. They were denied basic human dignity and had no hope of escaping their situation, which must have caused at least the same concern for Nelly. Would she really be able to simply walk out? After 10 harrowing days inside the asylum, Bly's newspaper delivered on their promise to secure her release. Her report, published in installments as 10 Days in a Madhouse, created a public outcry. The story exposed the inhumane conditions within the asylum and the ease in which a woman could be wrongly committed. Nelly Bly's expose remains a landmark example of how undercover reporting can expose social injustices and lead to real change. So how do you top such a remarkable undercover adventure? Nelly Bly decided to take on the world. Well, Earth, to be more exact. Jules Verne's novel, Around the World in 80 Days, was first published in 1872. Readers were fascinated by the idea of global travel, which seemed almost impossible at the time. It's hard for us to imagine the challenges and intrigue of world travel today, where millions of Instagram accounts have made the idea of world travel all but too common. But in the late 1800s, the idea of circling the globe was even more challenging to their imagination than going to Mars is for us. Jules Verne tapped into the public's growing curiosity about the world, spurred on by developments in transportation such as the steam engine and the expansion of railways and ocean liners. The title was an almost preposterous endeavor. It's worth pointing out that during that time, if you were going to travel around the world, you needed to plan for a journey of roughly 1 year. However, in 1870, eccentric American George Francis Train did the deed in 80 days. Yes, inspiring Jules Verne to write that book. Nelly Bly said, 80 days, hold my beer. Well, what she actually said was, I always had a desire to prove what a woman could do. In 1889, Nelly Bly went to Mr. Pulitzer and pitched that she wanted to travel around the entire planet and report on her journey. It wasn't the first time she had pitched this adventure. The Pittsburgh Dispatch laughed at her for the same suggestion years earlier. Pulitzer's editorial team thought the idea was swell, but obviously more suited to a man. After all, she only spoke English and would need help with all of her luggage, plus the idea of a woman traveling alone with no protector or chaperone. Silly, not safe, impossible. Her response, yeah, you're probably right. Let's find a big, strong man. What was I thinking? No, that's not what she said. What she said was, very well, start the man, and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him. This bold statement showcased her unwavering belief in her abilities and her competitive spirit. It also likely convinced her editors, including Joseph Pulitzer, that she might just be the right man for the job. The challenge beat Jules Verne's fictional, nearly impossible to imagine at the time record of going around the world in 80 days. To the absolute shock and possibly horror of those who witnessed the start of this Vernian journey, Nelly only took one bag. Impossible, you say? Well, there was some hijinks at play in her dress. Yes, Nelly designed a dress specifically for this journey. It had hidden pockets and would hopefully be comfortable in all manner of weather conditions. She did bring a change of underwear. Bly began her journey on November 14, 1889, departing from Hoboken, New Jersey, on the steamship Augusta Victoria. The excitement of racing against time and Jules Verne's fictional 80 days created intense public interest and pressure right from the start. Even so, while passing through France, Bly took a detour to northern France to meet Jules Verne, the author who inspired her journey. Verne was pleased to meet Nelly, but told her he was skeptical she could actually accomplish such a remarkable feat, to which she replied,
"Okay, you bish."
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
"Whoa, Nelly." While Nelly certainly dealt with stress and a tight schedule, she was never kidnapped, never attacked, never robbed. She didn't tire or randomly faint when the temperature went above 73 degrees. There was some engine trouble and a few intense storms, but she never had to escape a dire situation or lie her way out of trouble or trade her grandma's jewelry to save her life. I mean, sure, those things could have happened, but they didn't. For storytelling, it's a real bummer. But I suppose it's kind of the point she wanted to make. Her writings weren't fearful. In fact, she said, "I felt as though I was flying through the world on the wings of the wind." Upon arriving in Hong Kong, Bly learned that a rival journalist, Elizabeth Bisland, had been sent by Cosmopolitan magazine to beat her around the world. Cosmo. When Bly finally arrived in San Francisco on January 21st, 1890, she was just days away from setting the record. In a dramatic race against the clock, Pulitzer's New York World chartered a special train to rush her across the country. Rail companies cooperated to clear the tracks, ensuring she could make it on time. Pretty cool. As Bly's special train sped across the U.S., it was hampered by winter storms in the Midwest. Barely. On January 25, 1890, Bly arrived back in New Jersey, completing her journey in 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes, smashing Jules Verne's fictional record and establishing a new real-world standard. She was greeted by cheering crowds and worldwide acclaim for her adventurous achievement. Not surprising, Nelly stated, "I said I could, and I would, and I did." Okay, I could stop right there. Clearly, Nelly Bly is a certified grade A pure titanium legend. But to leave out the last chapter would be kind of criminal. Okay, she did marry a man who at some point died. I'm simplifying, yes. But she took over his ironclad manufacturing company and patented several inventions, including a cool new design for an oil drum that became a precursor to the modern steel drums today. Neat. But then, World War I came to town. And those deep-rooted, fearless, got-to-be-in-the-middle-of-it-all journalism instincts kicked in, and of course, she became one of the first female war correspondents. She went straight to the Eastern Front. In 1914, as the war began, Bly gained special access to the Eastern Front, traveling through Austria-Hungary and interviewing soldiers, civilians, and military officials. Her reports were vivid and detailed, focusing on the human toll of the war. She wrote about the impact on everyday people, as well as the destruction and devastation in war-torn regions. Nelly observed, "The war is like a huge machine that grinds to pieces everything in its way. And there is nothing in war that can possibly justify the slaughter of men." Bly's war reporting often highlighted the plight of refugees displaced by the war. She showed particular empathy for civilians caught in the crossfire, especially women and children, who were suffering from hunger, hopelessness, and violence. This humanitarian angle distinguished her work from more traditional war reporting that often focused on battles and military strategy. Her quotes like, "The misery is so vast, it seems the world has forgotten what peace means," as well as, "I felt a strange kind of empathy for these soldiers, men who were only boys, sent off to die." She had seen enough to say with full confidence, there is no glory in war, only suffering. Bly's war coverage ended in 1919 as World War I came to a close. Her experience reporting from the Eastern Front reflected her commitment to giving voice to the underrepresented and those suffering during times of crisis. Ironically, she noted that what the war has taught me is that people are kinder and more generous in times of suffering. Nelly Bly's legacy as an intrepid reporter, social reformer, and innovator continues to inspire generations of journalists and activists. Her willingness to take personal risks for the sake of truth, along with her ability to draw attention to critical social issues, marked a turning point in investigative journalism. Bly's stories, particularly her asylum expose and her globetrotting adventure, are among the most celebrated in the history of journalism. My favorite quote of Bly, you ask? "All through my life, I have ever been curious to see what lay beyond the horizon." Spoken like a true adventurer. Her legacy was so impactful that even 100 years later, a small YouTube channel called Intelligence was inspired to tell her story, a powerful example of a life of courage devoted to exposing those who would do harm to others. But do people still find her story and those like her to be inspiring enough to like and subscribe?
It's a waiting game right now. We won't know.
Only time will tell. McNutt out.